In the summer of 1941, an Army general sat across from a group of college-educated black men who had arrived in Tuskegee, Alabama, ready to fly for their country, and told them, in effect, that the Army didn't expect them to succeed. That was by design. The program they were entering had been constructed as a controlled experiment in failure. It would produce black fighter pilots, yes, but most of the brass believed those pilots would wash out, prove the skeptics right, and quietly close the door on African Americans in military aviation forever. What happened instead changed the United States Air Force, seeded the civil rights movement, and sent 992 men into the skies over Europe and North Africa with red tails blazing. This is the story of the Tuskegee Airmen, and of the 27 among them who never came home and whose families are still waiting. The Army Air Corps had resisted black aviators for years. When pressure from the NAACP, the Black Press, and the Roosevelt White House finally forced the issue in January 1941, the War Department's solution was not integration, it was isolation. A separate training facility would be built at the Tuskegee Army Air Field in Alabama, in the heart of Jim Crow country. Black officers would train black pilots, live in segregated quarters, eat in segregated mess halls, and serve in all-black units. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, put the institutional attitude plainly. Negro pilots cannot be used in our present Air Corps units, since this would result in Negro officers serving over white enlisted men, creating an impossible social situation. The goal was separation, not opportunity. The men who walked through those gates understood exactly what that meant, and they showed up anyway. The first class was 13 men, every one of them holding a college degree, some with qualifications well beyond what the program required. Their commander was Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., a West Point graduate who had been shunned into 4 years of silence by his white classmates. Not a single cadet spoke to him socially during his entire time there. He graduated in the top quarter of his class anyway. He led anyway. And the men who followed him onto those Alabama runways brought the same iron refusal. They would not give the Army the failure it was looking for. These men were fighting what the black press of the era called a wwii campaign, victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home. Both battles were fought simultaneously, often from the same piece of ground. A Tuskegee cadet might complete an hour of instrument training in the morning, and in the afternoon be denied a seat at a lunch counter in the town outside the base gate. The men of the 477th Bombardment Group, trained at Tuskegee for heavy bomber duty, staged a peaceful, disciplined protest at Freeman Field, Indiana, in April 1945, when they were barred from the Base Officers Club despite being commissioned officers of the United States Army. They were arrested. The war in Europe would end 3 weeks later. The conditions at Tuskegee were deliberate in their difficulty. The airfield sat in one of the most racially hostile regions of the country. Cadets trained in Alabama heat, under white instructors who in some cases expected them to fail, graded by standards designed to give the Army a reason to wash them out. Some were dismissed on grounds that seemed, to those who watched closely, designed to thin the ranks before any of them could reach a combat cockpit. The ones who stayed, and the overwhelming majority who completed training did stay, did so knowing they were not just earning their wings. They were making an argument. Every clean landing, every instrument approach in low visibility, every formation held tight over enemy territory was a rebuttal to every general who had called this an impossible social situation. The fighter pilots of the 332nd did not have the luxury of protest. They flew. They flew first with P-40 Warhawks, then P-39 Airacobras, then P-47 Thunderbolts, and finally P-51 Mustangs, each transition a test of skill that the program's critics hoped would thin the ranks. Instead, the ranks grew. By the time the last class finished in June 1946, some 992 black pilots had earned their wings at Tuskegee. 450 of them served in combat. The 99th Pursuit Squadron flew its first combat mission on June 2, 1943, striking the island of Pantelleria in the Mediterranean, a heavily fortified Axis outpost crammed with German and Italian troops and aircraft. The 99th distinguished itself immediately. Within a year, it had been folded into the 332nd Fighter Group along with three other squadrons, the 100th, 301st, and 302nd. Together, they became something the Axis had never expected and never wanted to face. They painted their P-51 tails red. It was a tactical measure to help pilots identify friendly aircraft in a turning, climbing, chaotic dogfight, but it became a symbol recognized across the theater. White American bomber crews, who had learned they could trust the red tails to stay with them all the way to the target and all the way home, rather than breaking off to chase individual kills, began calling them the Red Tail Angels. The men of the 332nd were not hunting personal glory. They were protecting the people in those bombers, and bomber crews noticed. Requests specifically for red tail escort became common. The Luftwaffe noticed too. German pilots who encountered the 332nd in combat gave them a name in their own language, Schwarze Vogelmännchen, Black Birdmen. It was not an insult. It was what you call something you fear and respect in equal measure. That name appears in the congressional record, the enemy's own verdict, preserved in the official language of American law. The 332nd flew 15,553 sorties and 1,578 missions with the 12th Tactical Air Force and the 15th Strategic Air Force. They struck oil refineries in Romania, railway yards in Austria, airfields across Italy and southern Europe. They flew bomber escort missions deep into territory bristling with anti-aircraft guns and Luftwaffe interceptors. On March 24, 1945, they flew a round-trip mission to Berlin, the longest escort run the 15th Air Force had attempted, and shot down 3 German jet aircraft in the process. By the war's end, they had been credited with destroying 261 enemy aircraft in the air, damaging or destroying more than 950 ground vehicles and rail installations, and earning 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 14 Bronze Stars, 744 Air Medals, 8 Purple Hearts, and 3 Distinguished Unit Citations. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., would go on to become the first black general officer in the United States Air Force. What the numbers cannot carry is the cost. 68 Tuskegee Airmen were killed in action. 32 were shot down and became prisoners of war in Germany, where they found themselves, by bitter irony, in more racially integrated conditions than anything the United States Army had offered them. One of those POWs, Alexander Jefferson, later wrote about sitting in a German camp alongside men of every background, addressed as an officer and treated as a fellow soldier. He had been denied that in his own country. And then there were the 27. 27 Tuskegee Airmen went missing in action during the war. Their aircraft were lost over the Adriatic, over Austria, over contested ground where wreckage disappears and records run out. Most were never recovered. Their families received the standard government telegram, missing in action, presumed dead, no body, no grave, no answer. For decades, those families waited. They wrote letters. They made inquiries. They were, for the most part, not answered. The men who had flown 15,000 sorties for a country that would not let them eat at the same lunch counter as their white neighbors had vanished into the sky, and the official silence that followed carried its own message. The same message those men had been fighting against since the day they set foot on a runway in Alabama. One of the 27 was Captain Alphonse W. Davis, a squadron commander from North Omaha, Nebraska, who disappeared over the Adriatic Sea on October 29, 1944. He was 25 years old. He held the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal, and the Purple Heart. He was never found. The names of those 27 men became the subject of the book Forgotten Souls by investigative journalist Cheryl W. Thompson. whose own father was a Tuskegee Airman. She spent years in archives, tracking down mission reports, next-of-kin records, and the descendants of men who never came home. What she found was not just loss. It was a particular kind of loss. Families held in permanent uncertainty because their government did not look as hard as it might have, did not follow up as persistently as it could have, and did not tell the story as fully as it deserved. The broader story of the Tuskegee Airmen took decades to be fully acknowledged. When surviving members and their widows gathered at the United States Capitol on March 29, 2007, to receive the Congressional Gold Medal from President George W. Bush, more than 60 years had passed since the war ended. President Bush said the medal would help atone for all the unreturned salutes and unforgivable indignities the airmen had endured. More than 300 of the original airmen were present at that ceremony. Some were in wheelchairs, some were in their 90s. They had been waiting a long time. 2 years later, the surviving Tuskegee-trained pilots were invited to the inauguration of President Barack Obama, who had written that his own career in public service had been made possible by the trail these men blazed. He stood before them as the 44th President of the United States. In the crowd were old men in their 80s and 90s, who had painted their tails red in 1944 and flown into the European sky for a country still arguing about whether they deserved a seat at the table. They had outlasted the experiment. They had outlasted the indignities. They had outlasted the silence. The 27 have not been outlasted. They are still missing. Their families grew old and in many cases died without the answer a soldier's family is owed. What happened to him and where does he lie? What the Tuskegee Airmen proved, at 30,000 feet over Europe, is stated plainly in the congressional record, that the experiment achieved success rather than the expected failure. The understated language of official documents does not capture the full weight of it. The full version is this: roughly 1,000 men flew into the sky for a country that doubted them, and they flew so well that German pilots gave them a name. Bomber crews called them angels, and the United States Army Air Forces could not, in the end, find a single honest argument for keeping them on the ground. The 27 are still up there somewhere. They deserve to be found.